Right. All right, so hi, my name is Tamika, and today I'm going to be presenting on Gadigal country, which is also where all of our research is being conducted. So I'd just like to acknowledge them as the traditional owners and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So I'm going to be talking about my current project at the Conservation Ecology Centre, which focuses around striking that balance between conservation and bushfire risk. If we want to change slides. All right, so this is the Carlisle. I won't spend too much time talking about it because everyone has pretty much touched on it today and Jack's gone into it in quite a lot of detail, but this little image here is my focus area, and to the northeast of it is Gellibrand, and to southwest is the Carlisle River. Now this is the Carlisle a little bit more zoomed in, and this is it even more zoomed in, paying extra attention to how thick that knee-high vegetation gets, because this is the long-nosed potteroo, just one of the cute little threatened critters that you can find in abundance in the Carlisle. And this is what makes up its home. This is the Australian grass tree, or Xanthorrhoea australis, and it dominates a lot of the heathy woodland vegetation, which makes up most of the Carlisle. Now this, change the slide. Yep, this is the same grass tree on fire in the dead of winter on a morning where I was like head to toe in wet weather gear and still ended up completely saturated walking through it. And my point being that the Xanthorrhoea, the dead skirts that form around the base of them, whilst make excellent habitat for animals like the potteroo, is also incredibly flammable. Like dead of winter can still burn flammable. And since they dominate a lot of this landscape, that also means that the entire landscape is at risk of catastrophic bushfires. So this has two major problems. One, the obvious risk to community that is caused by bushfires, and two, the loss of habitat that bushfires and other fires cause. And this loss of habitat can be lethal to threaten small mammals like the potteroo. Now, fire can also have positive impacts, particularly on the flora species, so that also needs to be taken into consideration. And that brings me to what this project's really about, not just focusing on those conservation objectives, but also developing a regime which can effectively manage forest fuel loads, kind of striking that balance between these two objectives. And already a whole lot of on-the-ground work has already gone into informing this regime, as covered by Mark and Jack, and also in some of the presentations coming after me. But sometimes you really just need to ask those what-if questions, those hypotheticals. So classically, the best way to manage the risk of bushfires is to take out the stuff that burns. So what you're trying to do there is knock out a part of the fire triangle, the fuel part, that will hopefully prevent bushfires from sustaining themselves. Now, the reason we target the fuel part is because it's the easiest part for land managers to manipulate. And so that's kind of what makes up their number one objective of modern burn regimes, to manage that forest fuel hazard by reducing the forest fuel loads and hence stopping bushfires. And undoubtedly, it's been proven to be effective. But how sensitive is the Carlisle? How much and how often do we need to be burning in order to have a satisfactory reduction in risk of bushfire? So understanding where we need to draw this kind of line helps us to become less rigid in how we define successful burning regimes. And this flexibility, which helps us to achieve a successful burn regime or fuel hazard reduction result, can open up the floor for other conservation objectives to kind of shine through in our regime. And this is where being able to test a whole range of different regimes, which vary in burn coverage and frequency, can be really beneficial. And to do this, simulations can be really, really beneficial because it's hard to kind of do a real world, range of regimes. But simulations have their limitations. They can only ever be as accurate as what you put into them. And when you're trying to recreate a real world environment, it's incredibly complex. So sometimes those inputs have to make assumptions. But they can still be useful in identifying thresholds where the burn regime is no longer having the desired reduction in wildfire benefit that we need to see. And this is because it allows you to play with two key levers, which is the frequency at which you burn at and the burn coverage. And so that's what our planned burning strategy is really focused on. So our first one was just trying to find a baseline, you know, what happens if you do no fire management of any kind in the Carlisle. And then from there, we decided to build our regimes around burn frequencies, so burning every 8 years and 14 years at a whole gradient of different burn coverages, starting at 10% and going up to 70% at 10% increments. So most of you listening to this are probably familiar with Phoenix, but for those of you who aren't, it simulates a single fire's development and progress under certain predetermined conditions. This doesn't really answer the question that we specifically want to ask, which is how effective planned burning strategies are at reducing the impacts of bushfires over time. And so to address this temporal element in collaboration with the FLARE team at Melbourne University, we used the Fire Regime Operations Simulation Tool, or for short, FROST, which is a fire regime modeling tool based off of Phoenix. And in less nerdy talk, for those of you who like to play computer games, and I hear the irony that that's less nerdy, but it's kind of like an expansion pack of Phoenix. So what I mean by that is Phoenix is still at the heart of FROST. It's the machine that does the actual fire simulation parts. But in order to address that temporal element in a fire regime, FROST incorporates 3 sub-machines. And those are the weather machine, which gives daily and hourly weather predictions based on your historic records or future predictions, and that depends on your question. An ignition machine, which is based on random forest and Bayesian network analyses to determine where ignitions are likely to occur in your landscape. And then a fuel machine, which predicts fuel accumulation both before and after based on a random forest model. So on top of these 3 sub-machines, there's also the prescribed burning component or the fuel treatment. And this is where it can get really interesting because you can feed in your own burn blocks, not just deciding where you burn in the landscape, but also the extent and the frequency at which you burn. And this means you can simulate your own personalized regimes and then see how all of these different regimes impact the landscape to form fire metrics, which is what FROST gives you. All right, so this is the same map that I showed you at the start. And so it's just to the southwest of Gellibrand, and that black square indicates my focus area. And the red lines are the road network for reference in the following plots. All right, so one such metric that you can get from FROST is the frequency at which wildfires or bushfires occur within the landscape. And just to be clear, this is only bushfires. It doesn't count the frequency of planned burns. And my simulation went for 100 years. So the first simulation that we ran was our baseline, which is no fire management of any kind occurring within the Carlisle. And within this figure, the white represents areas of no fire and dark red indicates areas of around 6 wildfires in 100 years. So the first thing I want to draw your attention to is that a lot of this landscape does see fire at some point within 100 years. And the second thing I want to draw your attention to is the areas of darker red. So that's areas where around 4 to 5 wildfires occurred within 100 years, or 1 bushfire every 20-ish years in those red zones. And what's really interesting is that this red area actually lines up almost perfectly with xanthorrhea dominated heathy woodlands. And what this tells us is that our simulations are working exactly how we would expect them to. That is, areas of highly flammable vegetation type are burning more frequently than areas of less flammable vegetation, say like the wet forest, which you can find towards the south of these plots. Great, now that we have our baseline, let's introduce our burn blocks. So these are the blocks that we used. They were based on 1, the road network, making sure they were accessible by tracks, and then 2, making sure they targeted that heathy woodland flammable vegetation. The next thing we needed to do was define the terms of our burn regimes. So you have to start somewhere. So I decided to start by binding our regime by the rules of an asset protection burn. Now, what that means is essentially it's a burn that needs to happen at a high frequency and at a high coverage in order to really keep those fuel levels down. So that's what we did. And our first simulation, we were targeting 70% of our burn blocks and burning at a frequency of every 8 years. And immediately you can really see that it was successful. Not only did you reduce the frequency of wildfire within your burn blocks down to 1 or 2 wildfires in 100 years, but also the surrounding areas in the landscape also saw a reduction. Perfect, great. Not too surprising. We do know that burning to reduce fuel loads is an efficient way of reducing bushfires. But how sensitive is this result, and how far can I push it before we begin to lose those benefits of fuel hazard reduction burning? So the next thing I wanted to adjust was the frequency at which we burn. So instead of burning every 8 years, now we're burning every 14 years. But between these two plots, you don't particularly see a whole lot of difference. It's still really effective at reducing the risk of bushfire. Great. Next, let's play with the burn coverage. So instead of burning at 70%, which was my higher end of the scale, let's go for something in the middle. So this is burning 40% of your blocks. And again, you don't see a whole lot of difference between these two plots. So we're still having the same benefit of fuel hazard reduction burning, even though we're only targeting 40% of our blocks. But let's really push it further now and drop down to a really low coverage of 10%. All right, so in this simulation, we're burning every 14 years, but only covering 10% of your burn blocks. So it's pretty low. And the first thing that I want to draw attention to is the areas, is that there is more fire in this landscape. So inside the blocks, you're still seeing a reduction, but in the surrounding area, fire frequency has increased. So it's not quite as effective as, say, 70% coverage. But if you compare this 10% to no fire management, like this, it's still effective. It's still bringing down that wildfire risk down to 1 or 2 fires within 100 years versus 4 to 5. So it's still working, which is great. What that tells us is that this system is actually more flexible in terms of the frequency and coverage at which you need to be burning in order to have a efficient fuel reduction benefit. Great. And this pattern was actually consistent throughout every simulation that we did, regardless of how much we burnt or how frequently we burnt. We still saw a reduction. As long as you are doing some kind of fuel hazard management in this landscape, you will bring down the risk of bushfires effectively. And I just want to be really clear that I don't think that these simulations can capture enough of the real world to design the perfect burn regime that takes into account all the important and competing fuel management objectives and conservation objectives. But I think that by acknowledging that we don't need to be as locked into common practice, defining common practice as high coverage, frequent burning, as we maybe initially thought, at least within the Carlisle, I think really frees us up to experiment and let other factors influence our burn regime while simultaneously still achieving a successful fuel hazard reduction. All right. So a further extension of this thought experiment is looking to help inform not just that fuel management side of this regime, but also the conservation aspect. And as Jack mentioned earlier, that involves some more modelling. Great. So we know that small mammals and potoroos negatively respond to fire, whether it's planned burning or wildfire, and therefore it's not really a stretch to assume that by changing the frequency and the coverage of our planned burns, we're not just going to have an effect on the risk of wildfire, but also an impact on the population of small mammals, particularly the potoroo in the Carlisle. And what we want to do is identify how resilient the potoroo population is to these various fire regimes. So that is trying to find points where the coverage of burns impacts too much of their habitat and causes their population to crash, or where the frequency of fire is so great that the population doesn't have time to kind of bounce back, and we also see it decline. So in order to observe these trends in the real world, it's not really possible and potentially a little bit unethical. But to simulate a potoroo population and then expose them to different simulated fire regimes, much more possible, particularly when you happen to have those exact frost outputs like burn frequency and burn extent already sitting there ready to go. And this kind of modelling is called a population viability analysis, or a PVA, and it works in a similar way as the fire regime simulations, and that is to give a basic understanding, we're here now, just to give a basic understanding of what the population dynamics look like. But the reason I say the word basic is because any kind of population modeling is actually, like, in order to capture a real world dynamic, you really have to simplify how it works and really focus on the research question that you're asking. And that means you have to make some assumptions in some areas about the population. But Despite these assumptions and simplicity aside, it should sufficiently identify general patterns of decline or threshold points where this population starts to tank or decline. And hopefully by pairing our fire regime scenarios with a PVA, we will be able to not only be more informed about how or what a robust forest field management program looks like at preventing wildfire, but also hopefully gain some insights into how resilient the pottery population can be to habitat disturbance caused by these bushfires or plant burning. All right. So I just want to finish by saying that no one burn regime of 70% or 10% is ever going to serve every single species within this system. But hopefully this simulation information helps us build a more robust burning regime. So thank you.
Thanks, Tamika. Great presentation. You, I suspect, deliberately have eaten into your question time, so you're off the hook, but keep an eye on the Q&A section, please. Probably worth mentioning too that whilst a lot of Tamika's work is incredibly modelling intensive, there's a lot of data, real-world data, that goes into informing and validating it. We're also, and we haven't talked about it, working quite hard on looking at how the fire and different fire patterns will impact on the vegetation and species richness in the Carlisle Heath, which we'll be able to present next year.